by a longtime observer of ink, panels, and page turns in the hearts of many readers, especially those raised in the golden age of the Beano, 2000 AD, or Eagle. The British comic book industry died long ago. It vanished from the corner shops, disappeared from school bags, and ceased to be the ritual of Saturday morning newsagent runs. But such declarations of death are often premature, and worse, misleading. The British comics industry did not die. It regenerated, quietly, slowly, but undeniably. As Andy Oliver, editor-in-chief of Broken Frontier, aptly wrote in 2017, "We're still too bound up in the UK in the narrow definition of juvenile literature, whose newsagent distribution, its British comics industry. That," he argues, "is the fundamental error in our mourning. We are not lamenting the death of an industry, but the passing of a particular incarnation, one we held dear because it marked our childhood. A Victorian birth, penny dreadfuls, and the appetite for imagination. To understand the trajectory of British comics, one must first understand its origins in Victorian storytelling. Long before spandex-clad saviors, there were serialized horrors, Varney the Vampire, Spring-Heeled Jack, and Sexton Blake, each issued weekly in what came to be known as the Penny Dreadfuls. These weren't mere entertainment. They were escape, rebellion, and in many ways, social commentary printed cheaply and consumed ravenously. Later came Funny Folks, 1874, and Ally Sloper's Half Holiday, 1884, setting a template, cartoon strips, recurring characters, satire, and working-class humor. The British comic was born not in grandeur, but in mischief and resistance. It thrived not in the salons of the elite, but in the pockets of errand boys. The Golden Age, the rise of the British weekly, fast forward to the 1930s, 1950s. The interwar years, and Webby saw the ascendancy of DC Thomson's classics, the Beano and the Dandy, which turned everyday children into anarchic, slapstick heroes. These were not idealized adults in capes. They were Dennis the Menace and Minnie the Minx. British comics weren't about saving the world. They were about surviving it, questioning it, and mocking it. This was working-class heroism with a grin and a catapult. Then came Eagle with Dan Dare, a post-war vision of British ingenuity in space. These comics were aspirational. They were grand, and they were, at their peak, selling nearly 1 million copies a week. But even then, the shadows were growing. The television juggernaut, Color and Control, the late 1960s, ushered in a new competitor, color television. Bright, instant, moving. Children now had cartoons, sci-fi series, and entertainment that didn't require imagination. It supplied it. Publishers tried to adapt. Comics based on TV properties, Thunderbirds, Captain Scarlet, TV Century 21, proliferated. But the shift was seismic. Comics, once a primary narrative medium, became a secondary one. Death by 1,000 cuts. Economics, distribution, and cultural snobbery. What followed in the 1970s-90s was not a sudden collapse, but a prolonged unwinding. 1. Production costs soared. Paper and printing became unsustainable at low cover prices. 2. Newsstand culture eroded. 2. Supermarkets replaced corner shops, demanding bagged comics with plastic toys, turning comics into costly novelty items. 3. Publishers sold their printing presses, losing cost control. 4. Distribution channels shifted, with power consolidating among fewer players. 5. And all the while, video games, VHS, and American imports chipped away at attention and identity. Ironically, British talent was thriving, just not at home. Alan Moore, Neil Gaiman, Grant Morrison, names now canonized in global comic lore, had to go abroad to find creative freedom. Marvel and DC gave them platforms. Britain exported genius, but but failed to hold on to it. The real death, a cultural misunderstanding, perhaps the most insidious decline, came not from economics, but from cultural perception. In the UK, comics were locked into a juvenile cage. They were for kids and only kids. Unlike France or Japan, where the bande dessinée and manga traditions gave comics legitimacy across ages and genres, the UK treated comics as disposable childhood fluff. Even graphic novels, when they arrived, were met with snobbish suspicion. It took Raymond Briggs's Ethel and Ernest and Jimmy Corrigan's literary awards to begin shifting that mindset. But then, regeneration, indie renaissance, and a broader vision. Enter the 2000s. Andy Oliver, writing with the conviction of a true believer, noted how British comics had been reborn not in newsagents, but in bookstores, small press fairs, and the hands of indie creators. He was right. A new ecosystem emerged. 1. Self-made hero, No-Brow, Avery Hill Publishing, Breakdown Press, each with unique identities focusing on literary, autobiographical, journalistic, and avant-garde comics. 2. The Phoenix, a successful weekly kids comic in the spirit of the Beano, but modernized. 3. Rebellion, now owners of 2000 AD, pumping out new titles, retrospectives, and revivals. Battle Action, Misty, Roy of the Rovers. 4. Children's graphic novels. Sales reached £20 million in 2024 in the UK alone. Where once there was monoculture, weekly gag strips, or adventure stories, there's now a plurality of voices. Memoirs, histories, romance, sci-fi, political commentary, and more. Comics are no longer just a genre. They're a medium. Philosophy of the page, what are we really losing? When people say British comics are dead, they are mourning the loss of a ritual. The weekly visit to the newsagent. The smell of cheap ink. The dog-eared stack under the bed. They are not necessarily mourning a lack of content, but the loss of a shared cultural rhythm. But perhaps what we are gaining is more meaningful. A chance for comics to be respected, to speak to all ages, to become part of the national conversation again, not just as nostalgia, but as art, journalism, literature, therapy, final thought, a medium reborn. The British comics industry didn't die. It evolved. It was forced underground, into indie scenes and art fairs. It scattered into anthologies, digital platforms, and niche bookstores. But it is alive. And if we care to look, we'll find some of the most exciting storytelling in Britain happening in panels and gutters. So perhaps the question isn't, what happened to British comics? The real question is, have you grown enough to follow where they've gone? Fleetway Publications and IPC magazines, bureaucrats of imagination. Fleetway, originally part of the mighty Amalgamated Press, later IPC magazines, represents both the heights of ambition and the slow suffocation of innovation under corporate pressure. Fleetway's empire was massive. Think Battle Picture Weekly, Valiant, Lion, Buster, Tiger, and Scream. It was Fleetway that gave us the gritty, grey-washed war stories of Charlie's War and the mythic scale of the Trigon Empire. It was IPC's Fleetway that crafted stories not of heroism in spandex, but of humanism in the trenches, football fields, and working-class estates. Yet Fleetway's downfall was philosophical. It treated comics like soap, disposable, cyclical, replaceable. Weeklies were shuffled, merged, or abruptly cancelled with little notice or ceremony. Their legacy, paradoxically, was vast but ephemeral. They were, if we may borrow from Orwell, the Ministry of Stories, efficient, grey, and utterly vital, yet unable to transcend their utilitarian roots. Amalgamated Press, the industrialists of the imagination. Before IPC, there was Amalgamated Press, founded by Alfred Harmsworth, later Lord Northcliffe, the same man who gave Britain the Daily Mail. AP began publishing comics like comic cuts and illustrated chips, essentially commercial junk for the masses, often reprinting American strips or plagiarizing successful competitors. But their circulation was massive, and they laid the groundwork for the mass market model. These were not idealistic publishers. They were industrial capitalists. They believed that the comic was a unit of consumption, not culture. And yet, through sheer reach, they accidentally created a collective mythos, a shared cultural canon for British children across the class divide. DC Thomson, Conservatism Meets Subversion. DC Thomson of Dundee is an enigma. On the one hand, deeply conservative, a Scottish Protestant family firm, famously distrustful of unions and innovation. On the other, they published The Beano and the Dandy, comics whose heroes were anarchists in short trousers. Think of Dennis the Menace, Minnie the Minx, the Bash Street Kids, rowdy, rebellious, joyfully anti-authority. That they were born under the roof of a company whose internal policies bordered on Victorian is one of publishing's great ironies. DC Thomson succeeded because they understood timing, tone, and tradition, but their failure was technological. They were late to digital, late to innovate beyond their legacy brands, and failed to grow alongside their aging readership. Still, they endure. Why? Because even now, there is something comforting, something British, about the idea that somewhere in Dundee, Dennis is still menacing. Marvel UK, colonization in reverse. In 1972, Marvel Comics did something curious. It set up shop in Britain. Marvel UK began with simple reprints, repackaged in black and white. The Mighty World of Marvel, Spider-Man Comics Weekly. But soon, it produced original British content. Captain Britain, Night Raven, Doctor Who Weekly. Marvel UK was reverse cultural colonization, the American myth filtered through British sensibilities. These comics were leaner, grittier, more experimental. Alan Moore wrote Captain Britain. Dave Gibbons drew Doctor Who. It became a training ground for creators who would go on to transform comics globally. Marvel UK's later ventures, like Death's Head and Warheads, collapsed under market pressure, but it proved one thing. The British comic voice was exportable, scalable, and deeply potent, just not within its native economic soil. The underground and small press, resistance in microcosm, while the titans fell or fossilized, the small press rose. Escape, Psst, Deadline, Crisis, Revolver. Titles that pulsed with counterculture, punk energy, and literary experimentation. Some, like Tank Girl, became cult icons. Others vanished without trace. But collectively, they carried the flame. These were existential publications, not driven by profit, but by purpose. Their ethos was philosophical. If comics are to survive, they must mean something beyond money. And from these fires rose today's indie publishers. Self-Made Hero, Myriad Editions, Avery Hill, Breakdown Press. They are small, but they are free. And in that freedom lies the future. The great irony. Britain created the modern comic book, but failed to sustain it. Here's the great philosophical sting in the tale. Britain invented the comic strip as a recurring storytelling art form, long before it was codified in America. Ally Sloper predated Superman by decades. Yet it was the United States that commercialized, franchised, and immortalized the form. Why? Because Britain refused to see comics as a serious literary medium. It locked them in the classroom cupboard after age 12. It mocked them from the broadsheets. It feared them when they dared speak to teens. It forgot them when television offered moving pictures. So what do we do now? We write, we draw, we read, we teach, we respect the medium. If we understand that comics are not just for children, not just superhero mythology, not just gag strips, then we allow British comics to live again, not as echoes, but as voices. As philosophers have always said, to forget one's stories is to forget oneself. And Britain, this land of Dickens and Shakespeare, of Orwell and Blake, should never forget that some of its most rebellious, most joyful, most humane stories were once told in 8-panel strips on newsprint.